Hey friends, it's Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. On this week's episode, we are going to take some time to discuss a prophetic perspective concerning the Khashoggi Affair, concerning the case of this missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Before we do, a couple of brief updates. If you've been considering or praying about or pondering coming with us to Israel and Jordan in April of 2018, then I really want to encourage you to go ahead and sign up. The reason is because we're actually filling up really quickly. We're probably a little over 2/3, pushing 3/4 of the way, all filled up again. We've still got several months, or a few months at least, before the deadline. Nevertheless, if this is something that you've been praying about and considering but haven't done it yet, then it's probably something that you do want to do soon. So this is going to be myself and Pastor Wes Martin again, April 2018. The way that you would need to do that is go to my website at joelstrumpet.com, and there is a banner ad right across the top of the website with a picture of myself and Wes Martin. Again, a banner advertising the tour. Just click directly on that, and it will take you to Living Passages website, where you can download a brochure, put in your information, and sign up, and everything's there for you. So we're looking forward to it. This is going to be an absolutely fantastic time, and we've got a lot of interesting potential other possibilities coming down the road, again, as various nations open up and different sites open up and this sort of thing. So more announcements on that soon. Second of all, my newest book, The Mystery of Catastrophe, Understanding God's Redemptive Purposes for the Global Disasters of the Last Days, co-authored with my dear friend Nathan Graves, is now available as an ebook, as Kindle ebook on Amazon. We will have some other options available down the road. And the hardcover will also be available on Amazon as well as on my website. If you want that signed copy, it will be released probably toward the end of November. I truly believe that this is an incredibly important prophetic book, a prophetic word for this hour. It's been something that's been in the works for a couple of years, and I'm really excited to announce the release of this book. We'll be talking about it some more in a few of the programs just over the next few weeks. So please do go ahead and jump on Amazon and grab a copy. And if you enjoy the book, then please do go ahead and leave a positive review. That always blesses the authors, and it helps the sales whenever a new book is launched. So thank you for that. Again, if you're blessed by The Underground, by this information teaching ministry, if you're blessed by what we do with Joel Richardson Ministries, then please do prayerfully consider becoming a regular supporter. The way to do that is to go to joelstrumpet.com, and across the top, click on Partner. That will take you to a link which will give you a few different options in terms of how to give. And so again, it means the world to us, and we truly do deeply appreciate it. So that's enough for announcements. With that said, welcome to The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, as I said, on this week's episode, we are going to discuss a prophetic perspective concerning the Khashoggi Affair. If you are not familiar, if you have not really been paying attention to the news, over the past few weeks, this has been pretty big. A Saudi journalist who has been living in the United States in sort of exile for roughly the past year or so, went missing on October 2nd, 2018, when he entered the Saudi embassy in Istanbul in Turkey. So Jamal Khashoggi, he's been writing for the Washington Post. He's become a bit of a very well-known Arab journalist. He had a couple million followers on Twitter. He's become a favorite for many throughout the Middle East. He was a Saudi citizen, okay, and lived in Saudi Arabia for many, many years. And then after Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince, sort of started announcing many of his reforms, he became a bit of a critic of Mohammed bin Salman, and he fled to the United States. He's been living in exile in the United States. And so his life was sort of in a bit of uproar. His marriage was falling apart. Well, he found a new potential bride. He hadn't quite even divorced his previous wife yet. And so he was in, and his fiance was a Turkish citizen. So he was there in Istanbul, had to go to the Saudi embassy to get the papers in order to divorce his wife. His fiance was sitting outside of the embassy. He gave her instructions in terms of what to do if he didn't leave the embassy. So he knew the risks that he was taking when he went into the embassy. But he went in, and according to his fiance, he never came out. He disappeared. So here you can see this has been a bit of a big news article. It was really October 11th, 12th that the news broke that he had disappeared. He had not been seen since he entered the embassy. The Turkish government released images from surveillance footage of Mr. Khashoggi entering the embassy again on October 2nd. Okay, so the news, the sort of splashed all over the place, was that he was killed inside the embassy. So this was the story, that the Saudis had sent a team of hitmen who were actually they were bodyguards, and they were folks that had been working directly for the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and they had flown in secretly on these sort of private jets, or they had just appeared in private jets a day or so before Mr. Khashoggi went missing, and allegedly he was cut up with a bone saw in the embassy. You know, all sorts of grotesque different stories that have been leaking out in the Turkish media and so forth. And again, just to highlight, the Turkish media is now controlled by essentially the Turkish government, run by the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Okay? So the Washington Post ran an empty article titled "A Missing Voice." So again, Mr. Khashoggi had been actually writing for the Washington Post, and it's important to emphasize that, you know, when you see all of this, you go, my goodness, I mean, here's sort of this guy who's a critic of the Saudi government. He's sort of a reformer. He's really a pro-democracy kind of guy. He's a moderate. He's a secularist. He's been living in the United States. He's been writing for the Washington Post, and so you go, gosh, this is terrible. You know, what a dictatorship, what an evil brute Mohammed bin Salman must be. So this is sort of the popular narrative that has been floating around, again, in mainstream, the Western mainstream media. So here's a picture of the newspaper, and I caught wind of this because Christiane Amanpour said, what a powerful, powerful piece that the Washington Post ran, this empty space, just to highlight the fact that this Western journalist is missing. And so this has sort of been the narrative. Everybody's been lamenting. There's been protest, free Khashoggi, free Jamal Khashoggi, and this sort of thing. You know, what evil, wicked government Mohammed bin Salman must be running, and this sort of thing. And I'm not making any comments on how I feel about any of this, not yet. Okay? My purpose here is not primarily to give you my opinion regarding foreign governments or any of these sort of things. I want to just simply focus a little bit on the landscape of this sort of geopolitical conflict and sort of look a little bit beyond the surface. Okay, so then, of course, the next big splash that's coming out of this is the protests of, again, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which anyone who's watched the show, who's paid attention to me for very long, knows that I am not at all a fan of Erdogan. I think he is an absolute dictator. He is the one to watch. Of all of the various dictators, of all of the most dangerous leaders in the Middle East right now, in my opinion, Erdogan takes the prize. I'm not saying there's not plenty of other evil people in the Middle East, but in terms of the dark horse over the past decade or so that I've been calling everyone's attention to, pay attention to this guy. He is the Adolf Hitler of our time. I'm not saying he's going to carry out a genocide, but he is the emerging megalomaniacal dictator. and American foreign policy, all of these things, we need to be extremely leery of this individual. He sees himself in many ways as the sort of messiah, as the parent, if you will, of the entire Islamic world, as the khilafah, the caliph of the leader of the Islamic world. He's sort of styling himself that way as the new sultan of Turkey and so forth. So here's just another picture of a headline. This ran in the New York Times. Khashoggi case raises tensions between the Saudi prince and the Turkish president. So not just between the Saudi prince and the Turkish president, but in many ways between the two, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of Turkey. This is sort of a big geopolitical issue that's causing tension there between these two nations. Now here's the thing, again, the popular narrative concerning Khashoggi is that he is sort of this Western American friendly. He was educated there, I believe, in the University of Indiana. He's this moderate, relaxed kind of guy. He's very reasonable and this sort of thing. So this is sort of the way the Western media has been painting him. Now, the reality is that is not who Khashoggi is at all. Now, again, I don't want to sort of go through his whole life story, but going back to the 80s, Khashoggi, again, he came to the States. He was educated in the States. Again, he went, I believe, to university in Indiana, went back to the kingdom. It was back during this time, during the whole period of the Soviet war with Afghanistan, that he began to be a real proponent of the Mujahideen, again, which went on to become the Taliban there in Afghanistan. And he traveled, and during that time he went, and who did he meet? Who did he sort of become a bit buddies with? Was Osama bin Laden. And so here's some alternative pictures, if you will, of Jamal Khashoggi. So here's a young Khashoggi. In one picture, he's holding an AK-47. This was actually when he was on assignment. He was sent over as a journalist to interview this young Osama bin Laden, and all reports say that he was quite enamored with him. Well, here's another picture of him actually holding a rocket launcher, hanging out with these Arabs, again, these young Saudis and different Arabs who had gone over to join the Afghani Mujahideen, again, who went on to become the Taliban, fighting the evil crusaders, the evil invaders, the Soviets and so forth. And of course, the Americans were arming, to be fair, the Mujahideen back then, who went on to become the Taliban. But some of these pictures have sort of popped up, let's say, in Twitter. In fact, Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., retweeted a picture of this Mr. Khashoggi holding the rocket launcher. And then a bunch of left-wing magazines and news outlets said, oh, Trump Jr. retweeted this faulty story. It's not true. Khashoggi was not really a supporter of the Taliban. He was not over there, as if he was a fighter with the Taliban. He was simply over there doing news reports. Well, look, I've met with different individuals, Islamic leaders and different things. I don't pick up a gun when I'm with them and pose with them holding rocket launchers and this sort of thing. The point is this. Yes, he went over to do an article. He went over to do some interviews, but he was clearly favorable to the jihad, if you will, the early jihad movement. Now, since that time, Khashoggi has become, his friends say, actually it was during college that he joined the Muslim Brotherhood. So he's always been an Islamist sympathizer. He is someone who greatly leans toward what journalists will often simply call political Islam. This is the idea that these Western autocracies, these dictatorships need to be overthrown, that we need to have Islamic governments. So case in point, the Muslim Brotherhood was put in power in Egypt in 2013. 2012 is when they came into power. They were thrown out of power in the summer of 2013. We're all familiar with this. Again, this was intended to be more of an Islamic moderate, so to speak. That was sort of Obama's claim that this was going to be a bit more of a moderate Islamist government. But this is what's called political Islam. Now, to put this in perspective, because oftentimes these things can be painted in a very favorable light. For years, people looked to Turkey and they said, look at the AKP party. That's political Islam. That's a Islamic democracy. That's what we want to see replicated throughout the Middle East. But the reality is that the Muslim Brotherhood, if you want to see a more accurate picture, something that everybody can relate to, what is the Muslim Brotherhood? The Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas. Okay, Hamas is simply the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, it's only a step or two away from ISIS. You know, yes, Hamas is not ISIS, but they are certainly on that spectrum. Okay, so this is who Jamal Khashoggi is. Now, for what it's worth, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the AKP party, is simply the Turkish branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. When the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, when Morsi was the president in Egypt, Erdogan wanted to essentially become his big brother and teach him how to speak in the media, to sort of become a parent, again, to these emerging Arab political Islamist governments. Okay, so this is when Erdogan saw himself as stepping into the fold, as having the ability and the capacity and the calling and the destiny to lead the Arab world back into more of a revived caliphate, of which Turkey would lead, really a revived Ottoman Empire, if you will. To go back to that time in history for roughly 500 years where Turkey ruled over much of the Sunni Islamic world. Okay, so now, of course, we're not surprised what happens in the Western media, in the liberal media in particular. So here's a post of a snapshot of Jake Tapper from CNN, again, a very left-wing commentator working for CNN, and how he is simply regurgitating a lot of the false information concerning Khashoggi that's coming out of, not from the Turkish government, but Turkish media, which is, of course, run by the Turkish government. And so Tapper was essentially reiterating or passing along the information that the Turkish government claimed that they had audio recordings of Khashoggi being tortured and murdered inside the Saudi embassy, allegedly recorded on his Apple Watch. So this was big news for a few days. It made a lot of big headlines in all sorts of different Western media. Well, of course, then the baloney card was pulled out on this. Even Apple said no, the Apple Watch does not have the technology to relay an audio recording from the watch to a phone, which was out in the car with Khashoggi's fiance. Okay, so that whole story, which again was promoted by the likes of Jake Tapper and CNN, different Western media, it turned out to be false. And there are a handful of other aspects of this story that have turned out to be false. The idea that these hitmen came in these private jets turned out to be false. Some of the pictures that were put out in the media turned out to be years old of these Saudis coming into Turkey. So just a lot of the Turkish narrative has begun to fall apart. Now, a lot of it has been pushed by Qatar, because Qatar is sort of in league with Turkey. And Qatar is where a lot of the Arab news information comes out of. And so it's sort of, again, a mouthpiece for the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, so where are we at with all of this? Well, first of all, we don't know the full story. We don't know what happened to Khashoggi. Was he killed in the Saudi embassy, or was he not? He very well may have been. But a lot of the stories, a lot of the information has turned out to be completely bogus. Essentially what is unfolding here. I want to go ahead and turn to look at a map of the Middle East, just so we can understand that what is unfolding right now is really the emerging conflict, that if you understand the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East right now, then you can understand the key players and why this conflict matters, why potential tension between Turkey and Saudi Arabia matters. Well, first of all, as we've talked about a bit over the past several programs, you have this new leader emerging in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the king, okay, the crown prince. In all likelihood, he will go on to become the king. He has suddenly burst forth onto the scene as a reformer. He has now made it legal for women to drive in Saudi Arabia, which was formerly considered to be one of the most repressive, radical Islamist nations in the world, other than Iran, which is sort of the Shia version of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has always been looked to as the closed kingdom, as the most radical Salafi, Wahhabi sort of run Islamist government in the world. Well, now he's allowing women to go to movies. He's allowing women to drive. He's talking about reform. And in the midst of all of this, many of you know this is very important to me, he's talking about building this mega city, Neom, up there in the northwest corner of Saudi Arabia. It's actually called a city-state. It would be larger than New York City. It's actually said to be 33 times larger than New York City. And as I've talked about in the past here, right in the middle of Neom is the biblical Mount Sinai. It's a mountain range known as Jebel al-Luz, and that is the real biblical Mount Sinai. Of that fact, I am absolutely, personally, completely convinced. And so I personally believe that this plan to build Neom is actually part of God's plan, because I believe that in this mountain, it's not simply a historical site, it's not simply an archaeological site, but that in this mountain, God himself has a testimony for the world concerning the reliability of his overall testimony, concerning the overarching story of redemption as told in the scriptures. The Lord is going to use the opening up of Saudi Arabia to convey a message to the world. So I believe in the sovereign hand of God that behind Mohammed bin Salman, that the Lord is doing something. So here you have Saudi Arabia in the process of reform. Now, to understand, what does Saudi Arabia represent? Saudi Arabia is the custodian to the two, according to Islam, holy cities of Mecca and Medina, right? And so these are two of the most sacred places in the world to Muslims. This is, Mecca, of course, is the heart. It's the very heartbeat of the Islamic world. All Muslims, if they are able, sometime in their life, are called upon by their religion to make pilgrimage to Mecca. Medina being the second holiest city, most sacred city according to Islam. Okay, so this in many ways is the heart. It's the womb from which Islam spread out to the rest of the world. And so the Saudis are the custodians. They are the stewards of these cities and this sort of thing. And Saudi Arabia is also in league, if you will, because of the petrodollar and all of these things with the United States. So in that sense, Saudi Arabia is a very, very important player in the Middle East. So with that said, you have to understand that Turkey, as they are now emerging, as they are now trying to rise from the ashes and reemerge as sort of this neo-Ottoman empire, they don't like the Saudis, okay? The Turks controlled, they were the custodians, if you will, of Mecca and Medina before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, before the rise of the Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian kingdom, so to speak. And so the Turks, in many ways, they believe that they are the ones that should control these areas. And it's been very upsetting to the Turks when the Saudis engage in some sort of a building project and they knock down some old Turkish castle or this sort of thing. This great big giant building, all of these hotels that now sits over the Kaaba right there in the middle of Mecca. In order to build that massive building, they had to knock down an old a Turkish fortress. And this was very upsetting to the Turks. Okay, so there's tension. There's a lot of tension. You know, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the emerging AKP party in Turkey, they see themselves as the alpha dog of the whole Middle East, as the leader of the whole Middle East. And so they don't like the idea of another potential leader in the Middle East as someone else who has any potential to be a leader, such as the Saudi royal family. And now, with Mohammed bin Salman emerging as a reformer, there's a tremendous threat there. And so these type of tensions behind the scenes, these sort of things that stir up, they are just sort of the symptom of a much larger conflict, a much larger tension. But of course, the tension is not only between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, it's also between Turkey and Iran. Of course, Iran sees itself as the potential leader of the whole Middle East because they want to spread their Shia Iranian revolution throughout the Middle East. And so the Iranians have their hands in Syria, in the government of Bashar al-Assad. They are in alliance with Russia, and they have their hands through the popular or people's mobilization units known as the Hashd al-Shabi there, which is a militia. It's a separate army, if you will, there throughout Iraq. And so the Iranians have their hands, throughout their tentacles spread throughout Iraq and Syria, throughout the Middle East, of course, in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And so Turkey is constantly trying to extend its power throughout that region as well. So there's tremendous tension between Turkey and Iran, but there's also tension between Turkey and Saudi Arabia because Turkey doesn't like any other potential competitor, any other potential leader. Well, beyond that, of course, you also have Egypt. Egypt views itself as sort of the brains of the Arab world, the brains of the Sunni Islamic world, because in Egypt you have Al-Azhar University. This is sort of like the Oxford of the Islamic world. This is the great heart of learning. This is where you go to seminary, if you will, to go become a sheikh, if you want to become an imam. This is where you go. You go to Al-Azhar University. And so in many ways, and of course Egypt is the most populous Arab nation in the world. Over 90 million Arabs there in Egypt. Okay, so in many ways, just to sort of give you a brief overview, understanding, again, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Right now, since the Arab Spring has blown through, what you have is, first of all, this emerging Muslim Brotherhood, Turkish Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But you also have this emerging Southern Bloc. And when I say Southern Bloc, I mean Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, and to a lesser degree, Lebanon as well. But really you have the king in Jordan. Again, he's in many ways a moderate. He's probably the smartest. I mean, he really knows how to sort of, keep all of his plates spinning and so forth. He's under tremendous pressure with all the refugees. But then you also have Sisi there in Egypt, who has stepped into power, again, after all the transition with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the United States, more than any other bloc in the Middle East, is in alignment with Sisi, with Jordan, with the kingdom, because we've always been in alignment with the kingdom. Whether it's right or not, we've always been in bed politically and financially, again, because of the petrodollar, with the Saudi kingdom. So we can kind of view Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia as the southern power. This is sort of the block, if you will, if we're talking in terms of Daniel 11. Okay, we're talking a prophetic perspective. Egypt was the king of the south. So if we're talking about sort of this king of the south coalition, we're talking about Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. As I said, to a degree, you could sort of say Lebanon, but really they're sort of in alignment with the ram, the two-horned ram, if you will, if Iran. But then you have the king of the north, okay? Again, talking Daniel 11, the king of the north is more Turkey, Syria, Iraq, that region. But right now, Turkey is really sort of the emerging goat, the emerging king of the north, the goat with the prominent horn, with the singular leader, with the singular dictator leading it. That's Turkey. Okay, so this conflict, it really is between the king of the north and the king of the south. Now listen, let me just say this. I'm going to insert my opinion. Did Mohammed bin Salman give the order for Jamal Khashoggi to be murdered in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul? I don't really know. None of us know. But here is something I'll just say to put this in perspective. If he did, then yes, it will give him a black eye. It's bad optics. Whenever any kind of like intel operation goes bad and becomes public knowledge, it's an embarrassment to the CIA or to any other group. In this case, obviously, we're dealing with the Saudi spooks and this sort of thing. If it goes bad, it's a black eye. However, if the Saudis gave word to kill a Muslim Brotherhood operative, someone who is an Islamist, someone who is buddies with Osama bin Laden, then let's just be honest. This is no different than what Sisi's doing. And yet we're openly allies with him and supporting him because given the option between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these various Middle Eastern autocrats, such as Sisi, such as the king in Jordan, such as Mohammed bin Salman, America is always going to side with the autocrats because we are going to prefer people who want to see a more moderate, more open form of government. And yes, at times they're going to violate Western principles concerning human rights, because we say, well, you can't do that. But look, I'll be honest, let's compare England, let's compare Great Britain with something like Saudi Arabia. Okay, Saudi Arabia understands that it has a problem with radicals, and they will do what is necessary to crush them. These Middle Eastern autocrats will violate human rights, and the problem with violating human rights is that at times innocent people's rights are violated. This is the problem, and this is legitimate. And I'm not advocating for a violation of human rights, but what I'm saying is these autocrats, with their iron fist, often know how to put down Islamists in their midst. On the other hand, you look at the UK. You look at the radical problem that they have, but they bow at the altar of diversity. They bow at the altar because diversity in many Western nations has been elevated to the place of an idol, of a false god. That, all of these principles, which are good, of equality and all of those things, those are actually subordinated, and it's diversity that is the most important thing. So if you start doing things like profiling and any of those sort of things, those are viewed as the greatest sins imaginable. And so the net result is that they have an incredible Islamist problem, and we will eventually see essentially the overthrow of some of these Western European nations to Islamists. We will see the overwhelming scourge of terrorism because they are not able to do what some of these autocracies do, which is crush the Islamists in their midst with an iron fist. It's really one or the other, human rights or putting down the Muslim Brotherhood, putting down the terrorists or this sort of thing. It's either a bit more of a police state or, at this point, because of the way these terrorists deal, you can't have one or the other. You can't have all of this unlimited security and not forfeit some things. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality. So the point is this. Mohammed bin Salman was just about to have this big conference up there with all of these tech companies, with all of these different companies to talk about investment in NEOM and this sort of thing. And personally, I have no question that this city will move forward. We will see it rise out of the desert. We will see people begin moving there. We will see industry move there. But he was just about to have this big conference, and all of these executives pulled out because the optics looked bad. Did this guy just order a hit of one of their own citizens on foreign soil? You can't have that. That just looks terrible. And I understand that they pulled out, but my prediction before you right now is that this thing will eventually blow over. I don't know. I mean, it could blow up before it blows over. I don't know. But the point is this, is that the plans will move forward, that Mohammed bin Salman will continue to show and reveal himself to be someone who is genuinely interested in moderating at least the image of Saudi Arabia in many ways, because there are economic relationships that are developing, even with groups in nations and states like Israel, okay, and the United States. And so I believe that he will continue with his project. I believe that NEOM will continue. And I believe that once we get past the foolish Turkish narrative that the Western media has been propagating, we will see that Khashoggi was, in essence, an Islamist. And if he did meet his end in the Saudi embassy, then again, it's really no different than what's happening in Egypt right now. Yes, there are some Muslim Brotherhood supporters and operatives that at times are mistreated by the government, but the al-Sisi government is doing what it can to maintain order among those who are genuinely a bit more moderate within Egypt. And I believe that that's essentially, although my opinion is not going to be very popular, that's essentially what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia right now as well. So with that said, that was just a brief overview. I hope that was helpful, just to sort of put everything in perspective. And again, I'm not advocating, one government or this government. I'm just simply trying to lay out to get a better perspective, a hopefully more balanced and more accurate perspective concerning the Khashoggi Affair. So that's all the time that we have for this week. I hope it was helpful. I do look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.